The room was silent, but my mind was racing. Clara had just announced her affair at our company holiday party, on full display for colleagues, clients, and a live-streamed audience that now counted in millions. I could feel the collective shock vibrating through the crowd, while a part of me was already calculating every possible consequence, every ripple her reckless move could cause. Not out of anger, but because chaos was the opportunity I'd been waiting for. HR would panic, investors would whisper, the media would feast, and the numbers could either crush us or skyrocket us. Calm didn't mean surrender, it meant strategy. Every detail, every public humiliation, every viral clip was now data, a map to reclaim control, protect the company, and somehow turn a personal disaster into an unthinkable victory. And in that moment, I realized the world was watching, everyone had an opinion, and nothing would ever be the same again. The morning after the Christmas party, the city of Nashville felt like it had been hit by a social media hurricane. News alerts flashed on my phone continuously, each one a fresh reminder of the chaos Clara had unleashed by announcing her affair in front of the entire company, investors, and a handful of very unfortunate witnesses. Everywhere I looked, my name, my company, and my humiliation were trending topics. Strangers were commenting, memes were popping up, and gossip chains moved faster than any official communication could. And yet, in the middle of all that noise, my home office was a sanctuary of calm. The sun was spilling over the skyline, painting the city with an almost serene glow that sharply contrasted with the storm raging online. I poured myself a coffee, my favorite mug in hand, and sat back in my chair, the same one that had witnessed 4 years of marriage, business negotiations, and now public humiliation. There was a strange sense of control in this quiet, a sensation most people would have mistaken for complacency, but it wasn't. Calm didn't mean surrender, it meant strategy. Clara's public display of authenticity had created chaos for the company and for me personally, but it also revealed weaknesses in perception, narrative, and control. While everyone else panicked, I was thinking 3 steps ahead, considering how this unexpected exposure could be leveraged, how the board might react, how investors might question or applaud, and how employees would filter the story through their own loyalties and assumptions. My phone buzzed repeatedly, notifications piling up, but I ignored them. Every text, every tweet, every viral clip was just noise. None of it changed what had to be done. The first principle of navigating chaos is not to be ruled by it, and I was determined to act deliberately, not emotionally. I reviewed the company reports, noting website traffic surges, spontaneous social media promotion, and early sales spikes, all of which contradicted conventional wisdom. Public scandals usually hurt brands, but somehow our numbers were climbing. The realization was almost amusing. Clara had thought she was rewriting the story in her favor, framing herself as a liberated, authentic hero who finally chose herself over corporate obligations and marital commitments. Instead, she had painted a target on herself, revealed company vulnerabilities, and inadvertently amplified our visibility in ways months of traditional marketing could never achieve. I leaned back, thinking about employees who would be watching, investors who might call, and competitors who would scurry to interpret the fallout incorrectly. Calm was the advantage. Chaos was predictable if you stayed grounded. Outside my window, the city buzzed with people who had no idea that the real drama wasn't in the streets, but in quiet decisions, calculated patience, and strategic positioning. This was the beginning, not the end. While everyone assumed my life had been shattered, the truth was the opposite. Every moment of public humiliation, every viral clip, every shocked text was now data, information to be analyzed, leveraged, and transformed into opportunity. Clara had launched the storm, but I was learning to navigate it, turn it into currency, and understand that being the calm in the eye of a hurricane was its own power. I could feel it already. Patience, strategy, and perspective were going to be my allies in the coming days. This wasn't revenge yet. This was the quiet before the controlled storm, and I had never felt more focused,
more ready, or more in command of a situation that everyone else assumed had already defeated me.
The boardroom smelled of polished oak, coffee, and tension thick enough to cut, and I stepped in knowing the room had just realized their orderly world had gone sideways, each glance and half-smile revealing fear, curiosity, and disbelief. Richard, the CFO, tapped his pen nervously, while Patricia, the VP who had publicly announced her affair, sat stiffly, eyes flicking to mine, measuring how much control she still imagined she retained. I let a moment of silence stretch, letting my calm settle over the room like a quiet warning. Nothing rattled me, and I was fully in charge. "Let's address the facts," I began evenly. "Patricia violated company HR policies, announced a relationship with a subordinate at a company event, and created a hostile work environment. We can discuss optics, but facts cannot be ignored." A murmur ran through the room, disbelief tempered by the clarity of what had occurred. Richard coughed and asked the question I anticipated. "Are we concerned about public perception?" Patricia added, almost rehearsed, "The media, the viral attention, people are talking." I nodded, acknowledging their worry while reframing it. "True, exposure is significant, but the numbers tell another story. Sales are up 42% this week. Our website crashed twice from traffic. 3 influencers have posted about us without incentive simply because they are drawn to the story. In 4 days, brand awareness has surpassed what 2 years of traditional marketing accomplished." Richard's unease deepened, and he asked, "What happens when the attention fades?" I let a pause linger before answering. "We return to our established strategy: quality products, ethical workplace standards, and sustainable growth. The audience has grown unexpectedly, but that is an opportunity, not a threat." Heads nodded slowly. Pens clicked, and comprehension replaced doubt. I outlined next steps: reinforcing internal policies, supporting loyal staff, and ensuring that any fallout from scrutiny was managed through procedure, not panic. Each gesture, each measured phrase conveyed confidence without arrogance. Patricia's face tightened, realizing her influence had waned, while Richard finally admitted, "So we follow your lead?" A brief nod from me ended the question, and the room exhaled quietly, tension replaced with reluctant alignment. Calm was not surrender, it was deliberate preparation, the kind that turns anxiety into order and uncertainty into compliance. The boardroom had witnessed more than a reckoning. They had seen strategy in motion, a leadership defined not by anger or reaction, but by steady focus and careful planning. They left with a sense that decisions were no longer theirs alone, that momentum now followed a controlled, intentional hand, and that every subsequent move in this unfolding chaos would be guided by reason, not impulse. By the time the meeting concluded, the room had subtly shifted. Trust, cautious but undeniable, had been established, and every board member understood that while the public saw viral spectacle, the real control lay quietly, efficiently, and legally in my hands. Authority no longer needed to be stated. It was demonstrated, absorbed, and silently acknowledged, planting seeds of respect that would govern every future interaction. By Friday afternoon, the data on my desk demanded attention, sharp and undeniable. Sales had risen 42% in just 4 days. Website traffic had spiked beyond capacity, and 3 influencers had shared our products organically, drawn to the story without incentive. Every metric whispered the same surprising truth. The chaos surrounding Clara's actions had become a peculiar kind of opportunity. I leaned back, careful not to let satisfaction cloud judgment, and allowed a quiet recognition of what had happened, circumstance and preparation aligning. Tara called from her office, her voice a mix of disbelief and excitement. "Gavin, these numbers, I don't know whether to be excited or nervous." I kept my tone measured. "Excited, yes, but cautiously. Momentum this sudden is fragile, and we have to treat it as such." She agreed, understanding that growth born from attention could vanish as quickly as it had appeared. I reviewed viral posts and social media patterns, noting the intensity of engagement, the unexpected advocacy from people who had once mocked me, and the whispers of new potential customers. Each click, comment, and share was a pulse, a signal to read carefully rather than a guarantee of lasting success. I briefed Tara and the team on operational priorities: maintain stability, communicate clearly with staff about what these numbers meant, and ensure that messaging reinforced credibility without appearing opportunistic. Every email, post, and public update was a chance to solidify trust, turning ephemeral attention into measurable progress. The irony was not lost on me. Clara's public confession, meant to humiliate, had inadvertently expanded our audience, while competitors watched unawares. Yet I reminded myself that growth without strategy could collapse in a heartbeat. I focused on interpreting patterns in behavior, brand sentiment, and audience reactions, treating each number as both information and guidance. In private, I allowed a subtle acknowledgement of satisfaction, not as triumph over others, but as recognition of alignment between action, timing, and preparation. By the time the week ended, I had a dashboard fully annotated, showing which spikes reflected sustained interest, which were viral flukes, and which needed immediate attention. This clarity turned raw chaos into insight, demonstrating that thoughtful, calculated response could harness events outside one's control. Data became a tool, not a trophy, a compass guiding measured decisions amid unpredictability. I reminded myself and the team that the real challenge was sustaining the results, not celebrating them. For now, observation was enough. Watching numbers rise, audience reactions fluctuate, and opportunities unfold in real time, without letting ego cloud the view. Even in unexpected circumstances, preparation and clarity could turn apparent setbacks into measurable gains. This moment wasn't a victory lap, it was a checkpoint, a careful assessment of cause, effect, and potential, proving that calm focus in the middle of upheaval could shape outcomes more than noise, scandal, or speculation ever could. The office hummed with a quiet energy that felt purposeful, as though the chaos outside had been absorbed and transformed into deliberate momentum rather than panic. And as I walked through the space with Tara, I could see how every interaction, every decision, every glance carried weight without exerting pressure. Calm didn't mean passivity, it meant active, precise control, a measured presence that allowed employees to think clearly, anticipate problems, and act confidently. And it was evident in the way department heads approached their tasks with initiative, in the way small victories were acknowledged without fanfare, and in the absence of hesitation that had once plagued meetings, as if the company itself had learned to breathe strategically. The marketing team moved efficiently, operations ran smoothly, minor conflicts were resolved quickly, and even vendors sensed the shift, responding promptly because they could feel the rhythm and competence radiating from leadership. While I quietly observed how subtle guidance, clear expectations, and consistent communication had replaced chaos with structure, and how the filtered team, those who stayed, reflected not only skill, but alignment with the ethical standards and culture we were building, demonstrating that loyalty alone wasn't enough, but dedication and accountability were rewarded in tangible ways. And this quiet power extended beyond immediate results, creating a foundation for sustainable growth where progress felt inevitable because momentum had been carefully cultivated. By midweek, small wins like flawless product launches, resolved operational issues, and spikes in engagement felt significant precisely because the structure made them meaningful and resilient, proving that influence was not about dramatic displays of dominance, but about shaping outcomes invisibly, letting people see the effects of their contributions and empowering them to act decisively within a framework that encouraged responsibility, trust, and clarity. And I noticed how even in complex situations, employees no longer feared making decisions because the guidance they had been given was steady, consistent, and fair, reinforcing their confidence and fostering an environment where challenges were approached proactively rather than reactively. And as I watched Tara close a report with quiet certainty, I realized that control without chaos was not about micromanagement or asserting authority. It was about creating conditions in which the right choices naturally emerged, the right energy propagated, and the right results became almost inevitable, demonstrating that the most impressive victories are often invisible until the results reveal themselves.
And by the time the day ended, the office felt alive with purpose, focused momentum, and measured efficiency, a testament to the fact that calm leadership, when executed strategically and ethically, transforms potential instability into sustained, predictable success, where every decision matters, every action counts, and every person knows their impact on the collective outcome, proving the true power lies not in being noticed, but in being effective, and that structure, clarity, and consistency quietly outperform drama, panic, or spectacle in shaping not only results, but culture, performance, and morale in ways that endure far beyond immediate crises.
Friday afternoon hit with an almost cinematic tension, and by the time the HR report appeared in my inbox, I felt the kind of anticipation usually reserved for high-stakes boardroom drama. 14 resignation letters in just 4 days. 14 out of 87 employees was a seismic shift in company dynamics, and each departure carried clues about culture, loyalty, and adaptability. I called Tara immediately, her steady voice bracing for analysis as I absorbed the details. "Walk me through them," I said, leaning back in my chair while the office buzzed quietly around me. She outlined the resignations, several from Clara's former team, a few from marketing under Eli's oversight, and others from employees simply unwilling to navigate the upheaval. None of this surprised me. In fact, it confirmed a principle I'd long trusted. Change exposes alignment, and alignment drives resilience. Those leaving were either loyal to chaos, tied to unethical patterns, or unable to operate under transparent standards, and their departures created space for people who thrived on competence, ethics, and responsibility. I reviewed each letter, noting phrases that revealed discomfort, avoidance, or frustration, but also clarity, the kind of clarity that allows a company to assess who genuinely belongs to the culture being built. This wasn't fallout, it was filtration. Calm leadership and consistent enforcement of rules had produced a natural sorting mechanism, one no abrupt intervention could have replicated. Tara's analysis mirrored my thoughts. Resignations reduced friction, streamlined reporting structures, and clarified managerial responsibilities. Each vacancy was an opportunity to recruit talent committed to professional growth and aligned with ethical standards, not distracted by personal drama or misaligned incentives. The report, intended perhaps as a source of panic, became instead a blueprint for future strength. Every name was data, every reason for leaving a signal, and every gap an opening to reinforce organizational priorities. Even as the city outside carried on with its ordinary rhythm, inside the office, clarity and momentum surged. This was operational advantage in real time, proof that strategy, patience, and ethical leadership outperform reactionary decisions. Calm leadership produced measurable results, and resignations were not setbacks, but accelerates, allowing the company to strengthen culture, focus energy, and prepare for growth unburdened by misalignment. By Friday evening, the office atmosphere had shifted from tension to purpose. Employees remaining understood expectations, systems were clarified, and the organization emerged more cohesive, more capable, and more agile. The noise outside, emails, rumors, personal gossip, didn't matter. The internal structure was now more resilient, more strategic, and better positioned for the challenges ahead. What initially seemed like chaos was in reality the essential catalyst for evolution, demonstrating that careful, principled action in the face of upheaval produces sustainable, long-term results, and that the quiet victories behind the scenes often outweigh any dramatic public spectacle. Strategy, calm, and decisive enforcement had turned potential disaster into a clear pathway for success, proving that the real power in leadership is knowing which battles to fight, which fires to extinguish, and which exits to allow so that strength, integrity, and alignment define the future, rather than emotion, ego, or panic. By the end of the week, the office had become a living case study in the power of natural selection within an organization, and as I reviewed the departing employees' patterns, I realized this wasn't fallout or failure. It was a filter, a precise separation between those aligned with ethical, competent work and those who thrived on drama, fear or indifference to rules. Each resignation letter, each hesitant explanation, each polite exit formed a mosaic that told me more about the company's resilience than any sales report ever could. Those leaving were either tied to past chaos, loyal to broken systems, or unwilling to operate in an environment defined by clarity and accountability. None of them represented a permanent loss. They were signals, opportunities, and even catalysts. This filter clarified the culture we were building, accelerated the path for high-performing employees to step into roles that mattered, and demonstrated that leadership didn't require coercion, it required consistency, principles, and patience. Tara and I discussed every detail, marking patterns, noting overlaps in departments, evaluating potential talent gaps, and imagining future hires who would thrive under transparent policies and measurable expectations. What might have seemed like disruption to an outsider was, in truth, the organization recalibrating itself in real time, shedding misalignment and reinforcing systems. I could see it in the subtle shifts in the office atmosphere: quieter conversations, less hesitation in meetings, faster decision-making, and employees who no longer worried about unpredictable drama. The filter effect was already creating a new rhythm, one based on trust, competence, and shared accountability. And I understood that the process was just as valuable as the outcome. Most leaders panic when people leave. I watched it as data. Each departure illuminated weaknesses, clarified decision-making pathways, and provided the chance to strengthen processes. Every role vacated became a canvas for improvement, every gap an opportunity for growth, and every concern expressed in a resignation letter a blueprint for preventing similar issues in the future. This wasn't callous observation, it was strategic clarity. By Friday evening, the office was calmer, the team more cohesive, and the air charged with momentum. Where there had been fear, uncertainty, and potential disengagement, there was now alignment and renewed purpose. I realized then that what people call loss is often a prelude to efficiency, that the exits of some make room for the emergence of others, and that strength isn't about retaining everyone, it's about retaining the right people. The filter effect wasn't just about HR or resignations, it was about understanding human behavior in a corporate ecosystem, applying patience, and letting natural consequences surface while maintaining a culture of principles, ethics, and transparency. Most companies try to keep everyone and end up with compromises, conflicts, and muted performance. We didn't. We filtered. And the result was unmistakable: momentum, clarity, and the early signs of sustainable growth, all achieved without public spectacle, emotional theatrics, or unnecessary drama. Calm enforcement, consistent principles, and measured patience had quietly transformed what could have been chaos into an operational advantage that would serve the company for months, even years to come. This, I realized, was not luck, it was strategy realized in real time, the kind of insight that separates reactive management from proactive leadership. And as I looked around my office that evening, I felt the satisfaction of watching alignment, accountability, and competence naturally rise to the surface while leaving behind the misaligned, the drama-driven, and the unwilling, a filter that would define the company's future trajectory.
By midweek, the aftermath of Clara's public announcement rippled through the company in ways that were quietly satisfying to observe. And while most eyes were on the chaos that had been unleashed, there was a subtler, almost poetic justice unfolding as Eli, her direct accomplice in both the affair and its dramatic exposure, began to falter under the weight of his own choices. He was no longer the confident, smug figure at holiday parties, but someone whose professional reputation had imploded publicly. His credibility eroded in the eyes of peers, potential employers, and even casual onlookers who had watched the viral video of his complicity with Clara, laughing at the spectacle while simultaneously cataloging his failures. And as reports filtered back, it became clear that every job application he submitted was met with polite rejection letters or no response at all, his social media presence offering nothing but a digital trail of his involvement in the very scandal that had destroyed him. The irony was sharp, almost cinematic, as the man who had participated in publicly humiliating me was now navigating a new reality where recognition brought embarrassment instead of admiration, where notoriety carried consequences instead of perks, and where the lessons of accountability, delayed though they might be, finally caught up with him in ways that required him to confront his own lack of foresight, judgment, and professional foresight. And yet there was no gloating necessary, no satisfaction in cruelty, because the universe had enforced the outcome without intervention, and observing this quietly reinforced the principle that actions have consequences, often unavoidable ones. Eli's fall wasn't loud or dramatic in the office, but it was complete, measured, and undeniably effective. He was forced out of positions he had relied on, his network subtly distanced itself, and he ultimately accepted employment in a role far below his previous status, one that offered routine, anonymity, and the bitter taste of humility as he learned to blend smoothies and serve customers who probably recognized him from the infamous videos, all of which he accepted without fanfare, because there was no one left to impress, no prestige remaining to salvage, and no narrative he could control anymore. Meanwhile, the company continued to stabilize, the filtered culture reinforcing itself, and every departure, including Eli's, was now a data point in the ongoing evolution of Ardon and Company, demonstrating that competence, alignment, and adherence to ethics would be rewarded, while poor judgment and participation in chaos, even if initially exciting or attention-grabbing, would have real costs, which created an unspoken lesson throughout the office about accountability and decision-making. I could see it in the subtle shift in conversations, in the way meetings progressed, and in the relief that followed the removal of drama-driven personalities. And while some might have interpreted the situation as cold or harsh, it was, in fact, precisely strategic, highlighting that consequences aren't vengeance, they are clarity, and that letting natural outcomes play themselves out often achieves far more than intentional retaliation ever could, all while preserving my own focus, energy, and the momentum of the company's growth. Observing Eli's fall quietly, without comment, became a small but critical affirmation that the structures I had reinforced, the boundaries I had maintained, and the patience I had exercised were not just theoretical, they were effective, producing tangible outcomes that aligned perfectly with principle, strategy, and long-term vision. And in the process, the story was clear. Those who sow chaos eventually harvest their own lessons, and those who act with patience, integrity, and strategy, not arrogance, emerge not only intact, but stronger, wiser, and ready for the next challenge.
By the end of that week, Clara had vanished from sight entirely, and the sudden silence created a tension that was almost palpable within the company, a strange contrast to the previous chaos. Because absence in this case spoke louder than any public statement or dramatic announcement ever could. Her social media accounts were private, her public appearances non-existent, and the office no longer had the background noise of gossip, speculation, or nervous energy that usually followed her movements, leaving everyone to process the aftershocks of her actions without her constant presence as a magnet for drama. And yet the absence itself was a signal, a reminder that she was still a player in the background, planning, waiting, or simply recalibrating her narrative for a potential return, which meant that no one, including me, could afford complacency. Her disappearance amplified awareness across departments, making it clear that the influence of chaos didn't necessarily require visibility, that reputations, memories, and viral moments lingered in collective consciousness long after the person behind them had withdrawn. And while it was tempting to interpret this retreat as defeat or surrender, a more strategic view revealed that absence could be its own form of control, an invisible pressure that prompted reflection, fear, or anticipation among those who had been directly affected. And the psychological impact of this silence was almost as potent as any confrontation could have been, because people began recalibrating their own behavior without a single directive. The lessons of boundaries and consequences internalized quietly, effectively, and universally.
Meanwhile, the company continued to stabilize under the leadership of those who remained, and the filtered, disciplined culture that had been gradually emerging solidified further, subtly reinforced by the unspoken message of Clara's withdrawal. Reckless choices have consequences, and disruption does not endure, leaving only those who prioritize principle, skill, and professionalism standing, ready to benefit from clarity and structure. From my perspective, Clara's absence was a relief, a reprieve from the spectacle, but it was also a constant reminder that vigilance was necessary, that even when the source of chaos recedes, its echoes persist, and that leadership required maintaining momentum without being distracted by the potential return of old threats, which meant using the silence strategically, monitoring developments, and ensuring that the company's direction continued to align with long-term goals. The public perception was equally fascinating, as observers, former employees, and social media onlookers began speculating about her next move, the mystery surrounding her location and intentions fueling discussions and reinforcing the narrative that she had become unpredictable, untouchable, and yet contained simply by removing herself from the stage. And this combination of invisibility and implied influence created a subtle tension that the company could harness in terms of morale, confidence, and focus, while the natural narrative of consequence continued to unfold externally. The absence of drama, paradoxically, became a presence, shaping decisions, conversations, and attitudes in ways that no confrontation could have achieved. And as I observed the calm, maintained the momentum, and let the filtered culture thrive, it was clear that Clara's disappearance, though ostensibly a retreat, was in fact a pivot that underscored the lesson that true influence is not always visible, that patience and restraint often outlast spectacle, and that the careful orchestration of outcomes, both by action and inaction, ultimately produces the most powerful results.
Exactly 10 days after the infamous Christmas party, while sipping my usual downtown cappuccino, a courier approached and handed me a thick envelope that immediately shifted the rhythm of my day. Inside were legal papers. Clara was suing me, claiming emotional manipulation, abuse of power, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. And while the accusations were dramatic, almost cinematic, the reality was simple. I had acted within my rights as a shareholder, enforcing documented company policies and addressing public workplace violations. Yet the timing, the theatricality of the filing, and the very public nature of the lawsuit created a sense of anticipation and tension that was impossible to ignore, because suddenly the careful control I had exercised over the company, the public narrative, and my own emotional response was being challenged by formal legal action, and the stakes were high, not because the claims had merit, but because the world now had a front-row seat to what might unfold. I forwarded the documents to Mark, my lawyer, who immediately assessed the situation with a mix of amusement and confidence, explaining that Clara's legal team had likely overestimated both the emotional and legal leverage of the case, that the documentation of company ethics policies, board approvals, shareholder rights, and social media evidence of Clara's own public admissions made this an uphill battle for her, and that while the optics of a lawsuit can be intimidating, in substance, it was a predictable response to losing control publicly, a reaction that, though dramatic, held little real power over me or the company. As the hours passed, the reality sank in. The lawsuit would attract attention, potentially becoming viral, because everyone loves a narrative of betrayal and legal drama intertwined. But in truth, it was an opportunity to demonstrate that meticulous preparation, patience, and adherence to rules could turn a personal attack into a showcase of competence and calm, reinforcing both my reputation and the legitimacy of the company's governance.
I reviewed each allegation carefully, noting how each claim could be countered with evidence, documented meetings, official emails, policy manuals, and the unmistakable video evidence of Clara announcing her affair publicly at a work event, an action that not only violated company policy but had created a public spectacle, undermining any claim of emotional manipulation on my part. And as I considered the upcoming court date, scheduled precisely 3 weeks out, I realized that this timeline provided a perfect window to prepare, assess public perception, and reinforce the narrative that consequences, not revenge, were being enforced. Every detail mattered: social media reactions, internal company morale, investor confidence, and the framing of each statement. And I began to see the lawsuit not as a threat, but as a predictable extension of chaos that could be managed with strategy, documentation, and composure, turning a potentially volatile situation into a controlled demonstration of governance and foresight, all while subtly signaling to the public and those involved that strategic patience and legal clarity outmatch impulsive drama, proving that even when personal and professional lives collide in spectacular fashion, measured action and preparation can transform vulnerability into strength, and that the world's attention, far from being a liability, could reinforce the very principles of accountability, consequence, and calculated response that would ultimately define the outcome of the case.
After receiving the lawsuit, the tension in my chest could have been a weight. But with Mark by my side, it transformed into clarity, because lawyers see the battlefield differently than the rest of the world. While the casual observer might be overwhelmed by the dramatic headings of emotional manipulation and intentional infliction of distress, Mark reminded me that legal claims are evaluated by evidence, procedure, and documentation, not outrage or theatrics. And in this case, the paperwork, emails, videos, and corporate records we had compiled were airtight, a fact that allowed me to approach the situation not with panic, but with strategic focus, understanding that perception often inflates the danger of a legal filing far beyond its actual merit, which meant that the next 3 weeks were less about fear and more about preparation, confirming facts, organizing timelines, and anticipating the opposing counsel's arguments while staying calm enough to make sure that every action reinforced my credibility, my control of the narrative, and my company's legitimacy. Mark explained, with the calm certainty of a chess master, that the court evaluates whether a shareholder acted within legal boundaries, adhered to proper corporate governance, and followed documented procedures, and that emotional claims without evidence of actual harm rarely succeed, meaning that while Clara could try to frame the story as a battle of feelings, the law was clear. Evidence mattered, and she had publicly provided the evidence of her own missteps, effectively undermining her position before we even stepped into the courtroom, which was a small but satisfying irony that I allowed myself to enjoy quietly as we worked, reviewing each piece of documentation, noting how every meeting note, email exchange, social media post, and company policy reference reinforced the legitimacy of my actions, and how every step we took in preparation signaled readiness, transparency, and calm competence, which was exactly what would resonate with both the judge and any public observers paying attention, transforming potential anxiety into confidence that the legal system favors reason, clarity, and process over emotional narrative, and that our strategy, thorough documentation, precise timeline, and objective evidence was essentially unassailable. I also understood that part of this lawyer reality check wasn't just about the courtroom, it was about mindset, framing the lawsuit as a manageable challenge rather than an existential threat, keeping public perception in mind, and recognizing that in any scenario where chaos could dominate, preparation, patience, and composure become your greatest assets, allowing a clear-headed approach to turn potential vulnerability into a demonstration of strength, reinforcing not only my personal confidence, but also the narrative that accountability and procedure, when applied correctly, always outlast drama, emotional outbursts, and impulsive behavior.
And that even in the midst of public scrutiny, viral attention, and personal history being dissected online, the disciplined application of evidence, law, and professionalism could render what seemed like a crisis into a predictable, controlled, and ultimately winnable scenario, which made the coming court date less a threat and more a stage for demonstrating that mastery of process, preparation, and patience always beats reaction, spectacle, and emotion, proving once again that in both business and life, calm competence is more powerful than chaos, and that knowing exactly what to do, when to do it, and how to do it is the ultimate advantage.
As soon as the lawsuit became public record, the internet erupted in a frenzy that was impossible to ignore. A storm of hashtags, memes, tweets, and opinion threads where every possible perspective collided. And while some of it was predictable, people dissecting the videos, debating morality, or rooting for one side over the other, what fascinated me was how quickly the narrative crystallized. The story was no longer about a failed marriage, a viral Christmas party, or corporate drama. It was now about accountability, timing, and strategy. And suddenly, millions of people were invested in watching the outcome of a situation that had previously been private, which meant that everything I did was under intense scrutiny, from public statements to social media activity, and even mundane actions became fodder for analysis. But rather than letting it overwhelm me, I treated it as another form of data, understanding that public attention was temporary but powerful, and that every post, every comment, every meme was essentially a reflection of societal perception, which could either amplify panic or reinforce credibility depending on how it was interpreted. So I chose to remain calm, letting the evidence speak for itself, and resisting the temptation to feed the fire with reactionary posts, knowing that the law, facts, and timing mattered far more than likes or retweets. Meanwhile, the memes were relentless but entertaining, ranging from clever wordplay to absurd visual exaggerations, and though some of the humor was pointed, none of it undermined the clarity of the evidence or the legitimacy of our legal position, which allowed me to observe the chaos without becoming a participant, transforming what could have been stress into a study of human behavior, public opinion, and viral attention. And I started noticing patterns. People loved narratives where the underdog remained composed, where patience trumped impulsiveness, and where the apparent loser quietly held all the power, which was exactly the story we were telling without posting a single explanatory sentence. And in this environment, every move, every prepared document, every email, and every timeline became a silent signal of competence, contrasting the emotional responses of Clara and her legal team, whose attempts to shape public perception often backfired, inadvertently reinforcing the narrative that calm, methodical action beats impulsive theatrics. As the online conversation swelled, reporters and content creators scoured public posts, compiling videos, screenshots, and quotes, which meant that misinformation could spread, but our clarity and documentation served as a stabilizing reference, a constant reminder that evidence always outweighs conjecture, and that no viral attention could alter the facts, only magnify them. And that in the age of social media, chaos could be observed, analyzed, and strategically navigated rather than feared, which made me realize that being recognized, quoted, and memed was no longer a source of stress, but a form of power, because in a world obsessed with spectacle, the ability to stay composed while everyone else reacts emotionally was the ultimate advantage. And by the time the initial shockwaves of virality subsided, the online landscape had largely settled into a consensus. The story was unfolding exactly as it should, with the person who had been wronged acting with professionalism and patience, while those who had created the chaos were left defending themselves in public, which was a spectacle in itself. And though I couldn't control every tweet, meme, or thread, I could control my response, and in doing so, I ensured that the narrative aligned with reality, not rumor or drama, turning the internet storm into an unintentional ally rather than a threat, proving that in the age of viral attention, strategy, patience, and evidence are your greatest weapons,
and that even the most chaotic online environment can be navigated with calm focus, turning public scrutiny into silent validation.
The day of the court hearing arrived with a clarity that made every detail sharp and palpable. The crisp winter air carrying the subtle tension of a city that seemed to know something monumental was about to unfold. And as I approached the courthouse with Mark by my side, the throng of reporters, cameras, and curious onlookers made the entire affair feel like a public event, a spectacle that was both exhilarating and oddly comforting because I had prepared meticulously for this moment, knowing that nothing could undermine the clarity of our position if we remained composed and focused. And inside, the courtroom was everything I had expected. Wood-paneled walls that held a history of countless judgments, polished benches that smelled faintly of old leather and ink, and the low hum of whispered speculation as spectators and journalists alike tried to anticipate how the events of a viral Christmas party and the resulting lawsuit would unfold in legal terms. While Clara sat with her team of 3 expensive lawyers, their expressions a mix of calculated professionalism and subtle frustration that betrayed the realization that they were about to face facts they could not manipulate. And as Judge Harriet Doyle entered, commanding attention without effort, her presence exuded experience, decisiveness, and a no-nonsense aura that immediately set the tone for a proceeding governed by logic, law, and evidence rather than emotion. And as everyone rose, I felt a quiet sense of authority. Not arrogance, but clarity. The knowledge that preparedness and documentation were far more powerful than rhetoric or theatrics. And when the proceedings began, Clara's attorneys attempted to frame the situation as retaliation, emotional manipulation, and abuse of power, trying to paint me as a villain orchestrating consequences for personal satisfaction. But each claim was met with calm, precise counterpoints from Mark, who guided the court through a meticulously compiled timeline of events, including documented company policies, share purchase agreements, board meeting minutes, Instagram posts, and the Christmas party video itself, the visual evidence leaving little room for ambiguity. And I could see the subtle shift in the courtroom, the weight of facts overwhelming emotional arguments, the judge's patience with misdirected narratives evident in her measured responses, which emphasized legality over sentiment, as when she asked whether any actions I had taken violated the law or company regulations, a simple question with a simple answer. No, everything was by the book. And the court observed that public humiliation does not equate to illegal behavior when proper procedures are followed, which became the central theme of the hearing, reinforcing that accountability and consequences are not acts of malice, but the natural results of choices. And as the session concluded with the judge dismissing the case, the room collectively exhaled, a quiet recognition that justice, clarity, and preparedness had triumphed without spectacle or theatrics, leaving Clara and her team to process the outcome, while I maintained composure, knowing that every element had unfolded exactly as it should, and that the story, though public and viral, had been navigated with precision, strategy, and calm authority, ensuring that the consequences aligned with reality, not rumor, emotion, or social media frenzy, proving that in high-stakes public scrutiny situations, preparation, patience, and professionalism are the ultimate forms of power, and that even when the world is watching, calm, fact-based action always speaks louder than drama, making this courtroom experience not just a legal victory, but a masterclass in strategic composure under pressure. Once the judge dismissed the case, the tension that had been coiled like a spring throughout the courtroom finally released, leaving a charged silence that slowly morphed into murmurs of astonishment from reporters, spectators, and even Clara's own legal team, who now sat frozen, processing that every claim of retaliation, emotional manipulation, and abuse had been met with irrefutable evidence and a calm, unassailable presentation of facts that left no room for exaggeration or spin.
And as Mark and I gathered our documents and stepped out, the corridor felt electrified with the energy of a story that had been brewing for weeks, a narrative fueled by social media frenzy, viral videos, and public opinion that had threatened to overwhelm reason. Yet now, with the case conclusively dismissed, the balance of reality had restored itself with precision, and I could feel a deep satisfaction, not from malice or vindication, but from having navigated a perfect intersection of strategy, preparation, and timing, proving that consequences followed naturally from actions, not personal vendettas. And as the press swarmed, cameras flashing and microphones extended, I delivered a simple statement. Justice was served and the law prevailed. Facts speak for themselves. A measured line that captured the essence of the proceedings without gloating. And as journalists murmured and recorded every word, the lesson became clear. Public spectacle, viral attention, and social media outrage can threaten chaos, but nothing trumps clarity and documentation. And as the crowd began to disperse, Clara remained in the background, her posture slumped, the confidence she had carried into the courthouse replaced by a palpable realization that theatrics alone could not override legality or truth. And the irony of her position was not lost on me, for every action she had taken, from announcing her affair at the Christmas party to relying on public sentiment over policy, had now unraveled with spectacular precision. Yet the dismantling was quiet, understated, and far more effective than any loud confrontation could have been. And in those moments, I understood the true resolution was not about shouting victories or mocking failures, but about letting facts and evidence operate in their natural order, which is why I left the courthouse with composure, observing the small victories in human behavior and institutional response, appreciating the elegance of a well-managed consequence. And as the day turned to evening, the social media storm reflected the same lesson. Viral moments could be dissected, debated, and memeified endlessly, yet when reality aligned with law and reason, public opinion shifted quickly, illustrating that transparency and preparation outweighed dramatics every time. And I realized that dismantling a false narrative did not require spectacle. It required patience, control, and the subtle power of truth, which had quietly yet decisively rewritten the public perception, restoring my reputation while leaving Clara to contend with the tangible consequences of choices made in haste and hubris. And as I stepped into the street with Mark, the city lights flickering around us, I felt the profound satisfaction that comes from watching chaos resolved through discipline rather than impulse, understanding that this module of my story, the dismantling of falsehoods, the affirmation of justice, the demonstration of calm authority, was perhaps the most powerful lesson of all, one that underscored the value of preparation, patience, and letting evidence speak louder than emotion. And in that single, quiet triumph, I recognized that the dismantling was complete, not with noise, but with the undeniable clarity of consequence, precision, and integrity, a lesson that would echo far beyond the courthouse walls, proving that in any personal or professional battle, strategy and composure always outperform theatrics and impulsiveness.
The gavel came down with a finality that seemed to reverberate through the entire courtroom. A simple yet profound sound that marked not just the dismissal of Clara's lawsuit, but the culmination of weeks of tension, social media frenzy, and public speculation. And in that moment, as her legal team shuffled papers in quiet defeat, and reporters jotted notes with a mixture of awe and incredulity, the truth was clear. The law had aligned with preparation, documentation, and reason, leaving no room for misrepresentation or drama. And stepping out into the winter sunlight, I felt a calm satisfaction, not because of triumph over someone else, but because meticulous planning and adherence to rules had carried the day, proving that patience, composure, and evidence-driven action always outweigh impulsive theatrics. While around me, the crowd of onlookers and journalists buzzed with commentary, snapping photos, asking questions, and recording videos that would become the new viral narrative. And yet, despite the media attention, the most powerful statement was in the silence of accountability, the subtle reminder that consequences follow naturally from choices. And as I gave a single, measured response, the court has spoken, facts prevailed. It captured the essence of the entire ordeal without arrogance, allowing the story to stand on its own, reinforced by clear evidence, timelines, and undeniable documentation. And as Clara sat in the courtroom, her posture now tense and reflective, the reality she had attempted to rewrite through public opinion and emotional appeals became starkly visible. Theatrics cannot substitute for compliance, and viral attention does not outweigh legality. And I understood that in this dismissal, the lesson extended far beyond personal vindication. It demonstrated that strategic patience, calm authority, and thorough preparation could turn a moment of public humiliation into a showcase of professionalism, a blueprint for navigating personal and professional crises with integrity. And the courtroom, once a site of fear and uncertainty, now felt like a stage where truth and order had orchestrated a quiet but undeniable victory, reinforcing that competence, not drama, wins in the long term. And as I left the courthouse with Mark beside me, exchanging brief smiles and nods, the city outside seemed to reflect this restored equilibrium. The hustle of life continued, viral attention would fade, and the clarity of consequence would endure, serving as both a cautionary tale and a strategic example. And later, when news outlets summarized the case, the headlines were restrained but definitive, emphasizing facts over emotion. And social media posts, which had threatened chaos, now mirrored the courtroom's lesson, praising methodical execution over impulsive storytelling. And the subtle victory was perhaps more satisfying than loud celebrations could ever be, because it required no gloating, no petty remarks, only the quiet affirmation that law, logic, and careful action have power beyond noise. And in this moment, as the winter light fell across the courthouse steps, I understood that dismissal was not merely a legal outcome. It was a statement about how to navigate adversity with intelligence, patience, and control, turning a public spectacle into a personal and professional lesson that would echo far beyond the day's events, leaving Clara to confront the consequences of her choices, while I moved forward with clarity, composure, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that in every battle, the best victory is one executed with precision, strategy, and dignity. 6 months had passed since the courtroom victory, and just as the rhythm of life settled into a predictable, satisfying pace, an unexpected ping on my email reminded me that some people never accept closure, that some stories demand one last attempt to rewrite themselves, and there it was, an email from Clara. Subject line simple, almost innocuous. "Can we talk? 5 minutes." I paused, letting the words hang in the air, appreciating the absurdity of timing. 6 months of silence, viral attention fading, quarterly reports breaking records, and suddenly, the woman who had publicly humiliated me wanted a conversation, presumably hoping to reclaim some narrative control. And I read her message carefully, noting the tone, the pleading, the attempt to sound conciliatory, to appeal to an imagined sense of empathy. Yet beneath the words, I recognized the pattern. This was less about explanation and more about testing boundaries, a final effort to gauge whether public opinion, professional standing, or emotional leverage might still sway the story in her favor. And I considered my options, weighing the risks of engagement against the irrelevance of her apology, the futility of providing emotional closure, and the satisfaction of letting consequences speak for themselves. And the decision crystallized instantly. No reply. Not out of pettiness, not from cruelty, but because 7 months of lessons had demonstrated clearly that some bridges, once burned, serve better as markers, as cautionary posts, than as pathways to unnecessary dialogue. And as I deleted the email, I felt the unique clarity that comes from absolute strategic detachment, the same clarity that had allowed me to navigate the viral chaos, the HR resignations, and the courtroom drama with composure, professionalism, and ultimately, a quiet, indisputable victory. While outside the window, Nashville's city lights blinked like a low-grade applause, a reminder that life continued in cycles of choices and consequences. And the best stories, the ones that stick, are often the ones where restraint triumphs over impulsivity, where patience and planning outlast emotion and spectacle.
And as I poured myself a glass of whiskey, letting it warm my hands while Whiskers pawed insistently at the glass table for attention, I reflected on how her final attempt to reclaim the narrative mirrored all the missteps that had preceded it. Public declarations of emotion, attempts to manipulate perception, reliance on theatrics instead of accountability. And in this last email, the pattern repeated, a microcosm of the chaos she had unleashed. Yet the difference was stark. I no longer reacted. I no longer played the part of audience or participant. I had become the observer, the architect of consequence. And in that role, every email, every message, every public claim she could make lost weight, significance, and power, reduced to reminders of her own choices rather than catalysts for mine. And as I set my phone aside, marking the final interaction as irrelevant, I felt a sense of satisfaction, not rooted in revenge, but in mastery. Mastery of my own time, my attention, and the narrative of my life. Understanding fully that this last attempt, so carefully crafted in hopes of engagement, would instead exist only as a testament to the enduring principle that when people act recklessly, the most potent response is composed patience, letting consequences unfold naturally. And so the story continued, quiet, resolved, and utterly under my control. And in the silence that followed, I realized that closure, if it existed at all, was never given by the other person. It was claimed by living well, by building, by thriving, and by recognizing when the final attempt at disruption was not a challenge, but confirmation of a lesson already learned, perfectly, completely, and without risk.
After months of chaos, public humiliation, lawsuits, and viral scrutiny, life settled into an unexpected rhythm of stability. And for the first time since the Christmas party, I could appreciate what true, quiet victory felt like. No viral posts, no dramatic confrontations, just clean quarterly reports, growth charts showing record profits, and the satisfaction that comes from navigating disaster without being consumed by it. The company thrived under Tara's capable leadership. Her promotion to CEO seamless and widely celebrated internally, and my role as chairman gave me the perfect balance of influence and distance, allowing me to make strategic decisions without the weight of daily operational stress. While Whiskers, now fully accustomed to the new routine, sprawled lazily across the office chair, demanding attention with soft nudges instead of chaos. And the contrast between the past week's turmoil and the present calm was stark. Where previously every email or notification could trigger a crisis, now messages were simply updates, invitations, or congratulations, each read and processed without emotional interference, a testament to the power of patience, preparation, and strategic restraint. I found myself walking through the office, observing the renewed energy among employees who had remained loyal, their dedication amplified by the clarity of leadership and the visible consequences of poor decisions, understanding that this quiet period was more than luck, it was earned through consistency, ethics, and composure. And as I glanced over the financial dashboards, seeing online engagement stabilize while revenue soared, I realized that the quiet win wasn't just a professional triumph, but a personal one. It proved that responding to chaos with strategy, not reaction, creates sustainable results that outlast viral attention, angry emails, and social media trends. And in this stillness, I also found the rare luxury of personal peace, the kind that allowed for reflection on mistakes, growth from experience, and the freedom to plan future projects without fear of being blindsided by the past. Because the past, with all its humiliation, drama, and public spectacle, had been accounted for, documented, and transformed into lessons that now acted as safeguards rather than triggers. And as I poured myself a glass of whiskey, the amber liquid catching the afternoon light through the floor-to-ceiling windows, I smiled quietly, appreciating the rare feeling of control that comes not from domination, but from careful planning, ethical decision-making, and trust in capable allies like Mark and Tara. This victory required no social media validation, no memes, no commentary. It was intrinsic, self-sustaining, and infinitely more satisfying than the temporary rush of internet fame. And while I still occasionally glimpsed news articles or online threads referencing the Christmas party, they no longer carried power over my daily life, no longer dictated my emotional state. And in this serenity, I found clarity.
True influence comes from what you build, not how loudly you fight. And every decision, every calculated action, every restraint exercised during those turbulent months had compounded into a reality where business thrived, personal life stabilized, and reputation endured, proving beyond doubt that the quiet win, when nurtured properly, outshines dramatic revenge, viral attention, or reactive emotion. And as the city lights of Nashville flickered on one by one, marking the evening, I realized the lesson was simple yet profound. The best victories are often silent, sustained, and entirely under your control. Because while chaos is loud, true success whispers, and whispers endure.
As the months passed, the chaos that had once consumed every corner of my life became a distant echo, leaving behind a landscape I could finally navigate with clarity, control, and purpose. A life where every decision, every investment, every professional interaction was informed by the lessons of the Christmas party, the viral videos, the lawsuits, and the personal betrayals that had once felt like insurmountable disasters, but now served as markers of experience and wisdom rather than sources of stress or regret. My company thrived, brand recognition continued to grow steadily without the need for drama. Tara's leadership ensured smooth operations, and my role as chairman allowed me to focus on long-term strategy, mentorship, and expansion without being dragged into petty disputes. And while Whiskers remained a constant grounding presence in my office, a reminder of the small, ordinary joys that endure even through extraordinary upheaval, I realized that my narrative had shifted entirely. I was no longer defined by public humiliation, viral fame, or anyone else's mistakes. I was defined by my ability to act with integrity, strategy, and patience, turning adversity into growth, teaching others through example that true influence comes not from reaction or spectacle, but from deliberate, principled choices that compound over time. The world continued to spin around me, full of new dramas, viral moments, and fleeting attention, but I had discovered the quiet power of consistency and ethical decision-making, a power far more enduring than any temporary spotlight or social media frenzy. And as I walked through my penthouse, sunlight streaming across the floor-to-ceiling windows, I saw the city below alive with endless stories, countless lives intersecting and colliding. Yet I felt a profound sense of detachment, the kind that comes from having mastered your own narrative while leaving the noise outside. Because control over your story is the ultimate freedom, and that freedom allowed me to plan future ventures, guide younger entrepreneurs, and focus on meaningful projects without distraction, without fear, without the need for validation. I reflected on Clara's attempts to reclaim attention, her wellness brand, her sporadic emails, and the fleeting viral attention she now pursued, and I understood that while the world had once treated me as a punchline, I had reclaimed the role of author, director, and protagonist in my own life, proving that measured, ethical, and patient action always outlasts impulse, chaos, and the drama of others' mistakes. And while I occasionally scrolled through social media, catching a meme or an inspirational quote referencing the events, it no longer dictated my mood or choices, because the story that mattered, the one I lived, controlled, and grew, was mine alone. And that realization, more than any viral fame, any financial gain, or any public vindication, brought me a sense of completion, a quiet satisfaction that came from knowing I had endured, adapted, and emerged not only intact, but stronger, more capable, and wiser than before. And as night fell over Nashville, city lights flickering like distant stars across the horizon, I raised a glass of whiskey to the journey, to resilience, to the power of strategic patience, and to the knowledge that while chaos will always exist in the world, the person who masters themselves, their choices, and their timing can create a life of true fulfillment, leaving the fleeting noise behind, writing their story on their terms, and finally understanding that the ultimate victory is not revenge, fame, or validation, but the ability to stand unshaken, quietly triumphant, fully in control, and ready for whatever comes next.